There is a man in the Bible who has no birth certificate, no family tree, no record of when he was born or when he died. He appears out of nowhere in the middle of a war, blesses the most important patriarch in all of Scripture, and then vanishes from the story for 1,000 years. No father, no mother, no genealogy. That is exactly what the book of Hebrews says about him. His name is Melchizedek, and for over 3,000 years, scholars, theologians, rabbis, and early church fathers have argued about one question that nobody can seem to answer with certainty. Who is he? Some say he was Shem, the son of Noah. Others say he was an angel. Some believe he was a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ himself, walking the earth centuries before Bethlehem. And then there are those who think the Bible made him mysterious on purpose, that God deliberately hid his identity so that thousands of years later we would still be talking about him. Which, if you think about it, is exactly what is happening right now. But before we can understand who Melchizedek might be, we need to go back to the moment he first appears, because the circumstances surrounding his arrival are just as strange as the man himself. To understand Melchizedek, you first need to understand the world he walked into, and that world was on fire. We are somewhere around 2,000 years before Christ. The ancient Near East is a brutal place. Kings rise and fall like seasons. Empires are built on conquest, and alliances are sealed in blood. There is no international law, no Geneva Convention. The strong take what they want, and the weak either submit or get destroyed. In the region around the Dead Sea, 5 city-states have been living under the boot of a foreign king named Chedorlaomer, the king of Elam. For 12 years, these 5 cities have been paying him tribute. Think of it like a protection racket. You pay the king, and his army does not burn your city to the ground. Simple arrangement. But in the 13th year, the 5 kings decide they have had enough. They rebel. They stop paying tribute. And Chedorlaomer does exactly what you would expect a powerful ancient king to do when his vassals stop paying. He gathers 3 allied kings and marches on the Jordan Valley with a coalition army, 4 kings against 5. But these are not evenly matched forces. Chedorlaomer and his allies are battle-hardened conquerors. On the way to punish the rebels, they crush every tribal group in their path. The Rephaim, the Zuzim, the Emim, the Horites, the Amalekites, the Amorites. One after another, they are all defeated. By the time Chedorlaomer reaches the valley of Siddim near the Dead Sea, the 5 rebel kings are already in trouble. They try to make a stand, but the valley is full of tar pits, natural asphalt deposits that turn the battlefield into a death trap. The armies of Sodom and Gomorrah collapse. Their kings flee. Some of them fall into the tar pits. Others escape into the mountains. And Chedorlaomer's forces do what every victorious ancient army did. They loot everything. They take the wealth of Sodom and Gomorrah. They take the food supplies. They take prisoners. And among those prisoners is a man named Lot, the nephew of Abraham. Now, this is where the story gets interesting, because Abraham is not a king. He is not a general. He is a wealthy nomadic patriarch living near the oaks of Mamre, quietly tending his flocks and herds. He has no army. He has no military alliance. What he has are 318 trained servants who were born in his household. 318 men against the combined forces of 4 kings who had just swept through an entire region and defeated every army that stood in their way. But when Abraham hears that Lot has been captured, he does not hesitate. He gathers his 318 men, forms an alliance with 3 local Amorite chieftains, and pursues Chedorlaomer's forces all the way north to the region of Dan, near the border of modern-day Lebanon and Syria. And then he does something remarkable. Under the cover of night, Abraham divides his small force into multiple groups and launches a surprise attack, a guerrilla ambush against a coalition army. The kind of tactic you would expect from a seasoned military commander, not a shepherd. It works. Chedorlaomer's forces are routed. Abraham chases them past Damascus, recovers all the stolen goods, frees all the prisoners, and brings Lot home safely. This is the first recorded war in the Bible, and Abraham, a man with no military background, has just won it against impossible odds. Think about what this would have looked like to the people living in that region. Chedorlaomer had just crushed every military force between Mesopotamia and the Dead Sea. Entire nations had fallen before his coalition. Professional armies, with trained soldiers, bronze weapons and siege tactics, had all been swept aside. And then a shepherd with 318 servants destroyed them in a single night. The people living in Canaan would have been talking about this for generations. The man called Abram the Hebrew had done something that should have been impossible, and that is the exact moment when Melchizedek chooses to show up. Not before the battle, not during the battle, after the battle, when Abraham is at his most exhausted and his most vulnerable, when the adrenaline is fading and the weight of what just happened is starting to settle in. The timing matters more than most people realize, but the battle is only the beginning of what makes this chapter of Genesis unforgettable. Abraham is returning home. He is exhausted. His men are weary. They have just fought and won a battle that should have been impossible, and as they make their way back through the King's Valley, two men come out to meet them. The first is the king of Sodom. He is grateful. Abraham just rescued his people and recovered his wealth. He wants to make a deal. "Keep the goods," he tells Abraham. "Just give me back my people." But the second man is different. His name is Melchizedek. He is the king of Salem, and he is a priest of God Most High. Now, stop and think about that for a moment. We are in the land of Canaan. This is pagan territory. The people living here worship fertility gods and practice rituals that would horrify most people today. And yet, here, in the middle of all of that, is a king who also serves as a priest of the one true God. The text says he brought out bread and wine, not weapons, not a treaty, not a political demand, bread and wine. In a world where every encounter between powerful men was a negotiation or a power play, Melchizedek brings a meal. He brings sustenance for a weary warrior, and that detail, bread and wine, would echo down through the centuries in ways that nobody at the time could have imagined. Thousands of years later, on the night before his crucifixion, Jesus would take bread and wine at a table with his disciples and say, "This is my body, this is my blood." The same two elements, the same act of offering nourishment to those who are about to face the greatest battle of their lives. Coincidence? Maybe. But the Bible is not a book that trades in coincidences. Melchizedek blessed Abraham, saying, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, maker of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." Notice the structure of that blessing. He blesses Abraham first, then he blesses God. He connects Abraham's victory directly to divine intervention. He is saying, in essence, you did not win that battle alone. God fought for you. And I, as God's priest, am here to acknowledge that. Abraham's response is extraordinary. He gives Melchizedek a tenth of everything he recovered from the battle. A tithe. This is the first recorded tithe in the Bible, before the law of Moses, before any commandment requiring it. Abraham voluntarily gives a tenth of his war spoils to this mysterious king-priest. And the fact that he gives it voluntarily is important. Nobody told Abraham to tithe. There was no law requiring it. He did it because he recognized Melchizedek's authority. He understood on some level that this man represented something higher than any earthly king, higher even than Abraham himself. And then Melchizedek disappears from the story. No backstory, no explanation of where he came from, no mention of his parents or his lineage. In a book that is obsessed with genealogy, that records every begat, for page after page, Melchizedek has no family tree at all. That silence is deafening. And it is intentional. But before we get to why that silence matters so much, we need to look more closely at what we actually know about this man, because the few details the Bible gives us are loaded with meaning. Let us start with his name, Melchizedek. In Hebrew, this is a compound word. Melech means king. Tzedek means righteousness. Put them together, and his name literally means king of righteousness. That is not just a name, that is a title, and it is an extraordinary one. In Hebrew theology, no human being can truly be called righteous. The book of Romans says it plainly, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. To call a mere man king of righteousness would border on blasphemy. But there is more. He is also called the king of Salem. The Hebrew word shalom means peace. Salem, or Shalem, is widely understood to be an ancient name for the city that would later become Jerusalem. So Melchizedek is not just the king of righteousness. He is also the king of peace, ruling over the city that would one day become the most sacred city in all of Judaism. King of righteousness, king of peace, ruling from Jerusalem. And he is a priest of God, most high before the Levitical priesthood even existed. The Levites would not be born for centuries. The entire system of Israelite worship, the tabernacle, the temple, the sacrifices, the priestly robes, the Ark of the Covenant, none of it existed yet. There was no law of Moses. There were no commandments on stone tablets. And yet here was Melchizedek, already serving as a priest of the one true God. This raises a question that theologians have debated for millennia. How did Melchizedek know God? Who told him? Who ordained him? In a world that had spiraled into idolatry after the Tower of Babel, how is there a king in Canaan who worships the same God that Abraham worships? The Bible does not answer these questions. It just lets the mystery sit there, and it will continue to sit there for roughly 1,000 years. But when the silence finally breaks, what comes next will shake the foundations of Jewish theology. After Genesis 14, Melchizedek vanishes. He is never mentioned again in the historical books. He plays no role in the stories of Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Joshua, or the judges of Israel. For 10 centuries, it is as if he never existed. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, King David writes a psalm that changes everything. Psalm 110 is one of the most quoted psalms in the entire New Testament. And in verse 4, David writes something that must have puzzled his original audience. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. This is not a casual reference. This is a divine oath. God is swearing, and the text emphasizes that he will not change his mind about it. He is speaking to someone David calls my Lord, a figure who will sit at God's right hand while his enemies are made a footstool beneath his feet. And this figure, whoever he is, will be a priest. Not in the order of Aaron, the priestly line that had been serving Israel for centuries by this point. Not in the order of Levi, the tribe God had set apart for temple service, in the order of Melchizedek. Why does that matter? Because in Israel, kings and priests were always separate. The king ruled from the throne, the priest served in the temple, and the two offices were never supposed to overlap. This was not an arbitrary rule. It was a fundamental principle of Israelite governance. The separation of king and priest prevented any one person from having total power over both the political and spiritual life of the nation. It was, in a sense, the earliest form of separation of powers. And God enforced this separation violently. When King Uzziah walked into the temple and tried to burn incense on the altar, a job reserved exclusively for the descendants of Aaron, 80 priests confronted him and told him to leave. Uzziah refused. He stood there with the censer in his hand, angry and defiant, and God struck him with leprosy on the spot. Right there, in the temple, in front of the priests, the king's skin turned white with disease. He spent the rest of his life quarantined in a separate house, cut off from the temple he had tried to infiltrate. The message was unmistakable. Kings stay on one side of the line, priests stay on the other. Cross that line and you face consequences. But Melchizedek was both. He was a king and a priest simultaneously, and he held both offices not in violation of God's law, but apparently with God's full approval, because the text calls him priest of God Most High. God did not strike him with leprosy. God did not rebuke him. Instead, God used him to bless the father of the Jewish nation. And now David, under divine inspiration, is saying that the coming Messiah will be a priest in that same order, not a temporary priest who serves until he dies and gets replaced, a priest forever. This is a direct challenge to the entire Levitical system. The priests of Aaron served for a time and then died. Their sons replaced them. Generation after generation, the priesthood was passed down through a family line. But the Melchizedek order is different. It is eternal. It has no beginning and no end. And David drops this bombshell and moves on, as if he has just said the most normal thing in the world. For the next 1,000 years, Jewish scholars and rabbis wrestled with what David meant. What was this order of Melchizedek? Who was this figure who would be both king and priest forever? And why would God bypass the Levitical priesthood, the one he himself had established, in favor of something older and stranger? Some rabbis proposed that Melchizedek was Shem, the son of Noah. This idea became popular in certain Jewish traditions, and it has a certain logic to it. According to the genealogies in Genesis, Shem was still alive during the time of Abraham. If you add up the lifespans recorded in Genesis 11, Shem could have lived to be 600 years old. And since he was the patriarch of the Semitic line, the idea of him serving as a priest of God in Salem was not completely unreasonable. The Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, an ancient Aramaic translation of the Torah that includes interpretive additions, explicitly states that Melchizedek was Shem. The Babylonian Talmud records a similar tradition, and some of the greatest Christian theologians in history, including Jerome and Martin Luther, found this identification at least plausible. There is also an interesting rabbinic tradition that claims Melchizedek's priesthood was eventually taken away from him. According to this view, when Melchizedek blessed Abraham before blessing God in Genesis 14:19-20, he got the order wrong. He should have blessed God first. Because of this error, God transferred the priesthood from Melchizedek to Abraham and his descendants. This is how the rabbis explained why the priesthood later passed to the tribe of Levi. Some scholars, including Professor Joseph Angel of Yeshiva University, have suggested that these negative rabbinic opinions about Melchizedek may have developed partly as a reaction against early Christian theology. As Christians began associating Melchizedek with Jesus, certain Jewish teachers may have felt the need to diminish Melchizedek's significance to prevent his story from being used as evidence for Christian claims. The Talmud notably identifies the archangel Michael, not Melchizedek, as the heavenly high priest, a move that some scholars see as a deliberate counter to both Christian and Qumran traditions. But regardless of the rabbinic pushback, the Shem theory has a fatal flaw. Actually, it has several. For one, Shem has a very well-documented genealogy. His father was Noah, his mother was Noah's wife, his brothers were Ham and Japheth. He has a complete family tree. But the whole point of Melchizedek, especially as explained later in Hebrews, is that he has no genealogy, no father, no mother, no beginning of days or end of life. If Melchizedek was Shem, then the description in Hebrews does not work at all. There is also the question of recognition. Shem, the son of Noah, would have been one of the most famous people alive. He survived the flood that destroyed the entire world. He was one of only 8 human beings who lived through the greatest catastrophe in recorded history. The idea that he could simply show up as the king of a Canaanite city under a different name and nobody would know who he was seems unlikely. And besides, later genealogies in 1 Chronicles and Luke still call him Shem, not Melchizedek. If they were the same person, you would expect at least one biblical writer to make that connection explicit. None of them do. So, if Melchizedek was not Shem, who was he? This is where the Dead Sea Scrolls enter the picture, and things get really fascinating. In the 1940s, a Bedouin shepherd stumbled into a cave near the Dead Sea and discovered a collection of ancient manuscripts that would revolutionize our understanding of ancient Judaism. Over the following decade, archaeologists recovered thousands of scroll fragments from 11 caves near a site called Qumran. Among those scrolls was a document found in Cave 11, now catalogued as 11Q13. Scholars call it the Melchizedek Scroll. And what it says about Melchizedek is extraordinary. This scroll was written roughly 100 years before Christ. It comes from a Jewish community that lived in the desert, a group most scholars identify as the Essenes. And according to this scroll, Melchizedek was not a human being at all. He was a heavenly figure, a divine agent of God, who would appear at the end of days to execute judgment and deliver the righteous from the power of evil. The scroll presents Melchizedek as the leader of God's angels in a cosmic war against the forces of darkness, led by a figure called Belial. In most Jewish tradition, this role belongs to the archangel Michael, but in 11Q13, it is Melchizedek who leads the armies of light against the armies of darkness. And here is the part that shocked scholars when they first translated it. The scroll quotes Isaiah 52:7, which says, "How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the messenger who says to Zion, 'Your God reigns.'" But in the scroll's interpretation, it is not God who reigns, it is Melchizedek. The Hebrew word Elohim, which usually refers to God himself, is applied directly to Melchizedek. That is an astonishing claim. This Jewish community, writing a century before Jesus was born, was describing Melchizedek as a divine being who sits in God's council, judges the nations, and delivers the righteous. He is called Elohim. He atones for sins. He brings about the great jubilee, the ultimate liberation. The scroll also connects Melchizedek to Daniel's prophecy of the 70 weeks, suggesting that he is the anointed prince mentioned in Daniel 9:25. This means the Qumran community saw Melchizedek not just as a historical figure from Genesis, but as a messianic figure who would appear at the climax of history. Now, the Essenes were not mainstream Judaism. Their views were considered extreme by many of their contemporaries, but what their scroll reveals is that long before Christians began connecting Melchizedek to Jesus, Jewish communities were already treating this mysterious figure as something far more than human. And that's exactly the line of thought that the New Testament would pick up and develop into one of its most sophisticated theological arguments. But the Qumran community was not the only Jewish group fascinated by Melchizedek before Christianity emerged. Around the same time, a Jewish philosopher named Philo of Alexandria, who lived in the early 1st century, made an extraordinary connection. Philo identified Melchizedek with the Logos, the divine Word of God. For Philo, the Logos was the intermediary between God and creation, the rational principle through which God acts in the world. And he saw Melchizedek as a physical manifestation of that principle. This is remarkable because the opening of the Gospel of John uses that same concept. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John goes on to say that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, referring to Jesus. The theological thread connecting Melchizedek to the Logos to Jesus was already being woven before Christianity formally existed. What we see when we step back and look at the whole picture is that Melchizedek was never forgotten. Not really. Even during the centuries when he disappeared from the biblical narrative, his shadow lingered in Jewish thought, growing larger and more mysterious with each generation. By the time the writer of Hebrews sat down to make his argument, there was already a rich tradition of speculation and theology built around this one enigmatic figure from Genesis 14. And there is one more ancient text that adds to the mystery. The second book of Enoch, also known as the Slavonic Enoch, contains a bizarre story about Melchizedek's birth. In this text, Melchizedek is miraculously born to the wife of Noah's brother Ner. The child is born fully formed, with the badge of priesthood already on his chest, and he can speak from birth. Before the great flood, God sends the archangel Michael to take the infant Melchizedek to paradise, preserving him to become an eternal priest. Now, Second Enoch is not considered scripture by any major religious tradition. It is a pseudepigraphal text, meaning it was written under a false attribution, probably sometime in the 1st century. But it shows us something important. The mystery of Melchizedek was so compelling that ancient writers felt compelled to fill in the gaps. They could not leave the mystery alone. They had to explain where he came from, even if it meant inventing an origin story that reads like something out of a fantasy novel. The impulse to solve the mystery of Melchizedek is ancient. We are not the first generation to wonder about him. We will not be the last. The book of Hebrews is unlike any other book in the New Testament. It reads more like a theological lecture than a letter, and the writer spends an extraordinary amount of time on a subject that most people today have never even heard of: Melchizedek. An entire chapter of the New Testament, Hebrews 7, is devoted to explaining the significance of just 3 verses from Genesis. 3 verses. That is how important the writer of Hebrews considers Melchizedek to be. The argument begins at the end of chapter 5, where the writer tells his audience that Jesus has been designated by God as a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. He wants to explain what this means, but he pauses and says something interesting. He tells his readers that this topic is hard to explain, not because it is overly complex, but because they have become dull in their hearing. He is frustrated that they are not ready for the depth of what he wants to teach them. He circles back to the topic in chapter 7, and this time he goes all in. First, he breaks down Melchizedek's name, King of Righteousness, then his title, King of Salem, which is King of Peace. He notes that Melchizedek is described as being without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. And then he makes the key statement, made like the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. Now, scholars disagree about what exactly the writer means here. Some believe he is saying that Melchizedek was literally without parents, that he was a divine being who existed eternally. If that is the case, then Melchizedek might be a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ himself, or perhaps an angelic being of some kind. But other scholars argue that the writer is making a literary point, not a literal one. In the ancient world, a priest's authority came from his family line. If you could not prove your descent from Aaron, you could not serve as a priest. When the Israelites returned from exile in Babylon, some families tried to claim priestly status, but because they could not find their genealogical records, they were excluded from the priesthood entirely. So when the writer of Hebrews says Melchizedek had no father, no mother, no genealogy, he may not be saying the man was literally born without parents. He may be saying that the Bible deliberately omits these details to make a theological point. By leaving Melchizedek's origin blank, God ensured that his priesthood would stand on its own, not dependent on family heritage, not limited by death, not passed from father to son. This is what scholars call an argument from silence. The silence in the text is not an accident. It is the message, and the message is devastating for the old priestly system, because what the writer does next is one of the most clever logical moves in the entire Bible. If Melchizedek's priesthood was not based on genealogy, and if Abraham himself acknowledged Melchizedek's superiority by giving him a tithe, then Melchizedek's priesthood is greater than Aaron's. Not just different, greater. The writer of Hebrews drives this point home with a brilliantly logical argument. Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek. Levi was a descendant of Abraham. Therefore, in a sense, Levi himself paid tithes to Melchizedek through Abraham, because Levi was still in the loins of his ancestor when the encounter took place. The lesser pays tithes to the greater. Levi paid tithes to Melchizedek through Abraham. Therefore, Melchizedek is greater than Levi. And if Melchizedek's priesthood is greater than Levi's, then the one who serves in the order of Melchizedek is greater than any Levitical priest who ever lived. That one, according to the writer of Hebrews, is Jesus. This is where the entire argument converges. The writer of Hebrews is not just fascinated by Melchizedek as a historical curiosity. He is building a case for something that should have been impossible under Jewish law. This was a real problem for early Jewish Christians. The law of Moses was clear. Priests come from the tribe of Levi. Jesus was from the tribe of Judah. So how could Jesus serve as a high priest? The answer, according to Hebrews, is that Jesus does not serve in the Levitical order at all. He serves in a different order entirely, an older order, a superior order, the order of Melchizedek. And just like Melchizedek, Jesus holds two offices simultaneously. He is both king and priest, king of righteousness and king of peace. He did not inherit his priesthood from his earthly father, because Joseph was not a priest. His priesthood, like Melchizedek's, does not depend on genealogy. It depends on the power of an indestructible life. That phrase, the power of an indestructible life, is straight from Hebrews 7:16. The Levitical priests served until they died. Then their sons took over. Generation after generation, the priesthood was passed down through death. But a priest in the order of Melchizedek does not die. His priesthood does not transfer. It is permanent, eternal. The writer even makes the point that the Levitical law itself was not perfect. If perfection could have come through the Levitical priesthood, he asks, why would God ever promise another priest in a different order? The fact that God swore an oath in Psalm 110, establishing a new priesthood in the order of Melchizedek, means the old system was always meant to be temporary. It was a shadow of something greater that was coming, and that something greater, the writer argues, is Jesus. He is the priest who does not die. He is the king who rules with righteousness. He is the mediator of a new covenant, better than the old one, because it is based on better promises, and his priesthood, unlike Aaron's, is guaranteed by God's unbreakable oath. The bread and wine that Melchizedek brought to Abraham. Christians see that as a foreshadowing of communion, the Lord's Supper, where bread and wine represent the body and blood of Christ. The blessing that Melchizedek spoke over Abraham, a preview of the spiritual blessings that would come through Christ. The tithe that Abraham gave, an acknowledgement that something greater than the Levitical system was at work. Everything about Melchizedek, from his mysterious appearance to his dual role as king and priest to his eternal priesthood, is a shadow pointing forward to Jesus. At least, that is what the writer of Hebrews argues. And it is one of the most sophisticated theological arguments in the entire New Testament. But we are not done, because there is one more theory about Melchizedek, and if it is true, it changes everything we just discussed. Not just about Melchizedek, about the entire Old Testament. Some scholars and theologians believe that Melchizedek was not a type of Christ. They believe he was Christ, a pre-incarnate appearance of the Son of God, walking the earth in human form centuries before he was born in Bethlehem. The Bible records several instances where God appears in physical form. Theologians call these theophanies, or more specifically, Christophanies, appearances of Christ before his incarnation. The three visitors who came to Abraham at Mamre, one of whom Abraham addresses as Lord, is often cited as an example. The mysterious figure who wrestled with Jacob through the night is another. The commander of the army of the Lord who appeared to Joshua before the Battle of Jericho. Some scholars see Melchizedek as another such appearance. The argument goes like this. Hebrews says, Melchizedek had no father, no mother, no beginning of days, no end of life. If taken literally, that description cannot apply to any human being. It can only apply to a divine being. And since Melchizedek is called made like the Son of God, some interpret that to mean he resembled the Son of God because he was the Son of God, appearing in a form that foreshadowed his eventual incarnation. This view was held by some early church fathers and remains popular in certain Christian circles today. It has a certain elegance to it. If Melchizedek was the pre-incarnate Christ, then everything in the passage makes perfect sense. His lack of genealogy, his eternal priesthood, his superiority to Abraham, his dual role as king and priest, all of these become straightforward rather than mysterious. But there is a problem, and it comes from the exact verse that is supposed to prove the theory. Hebrews 7:3 says, Melchizedek was made like the Son of God. The word like implies a comparison between two different things. You do not say someone is like themselves. If Melchizedek was Jesus, the writer would not need to say he was made like the Son of God. He would simply say he was the Son of God. There is also the broader argument of Hebrews, The entire point the writer is making is that Jesus serves as a priest in the order of Melchizedek. An order implies a category, a type of priesthood. If Jesus and Melchizedek are the same person, there is no order. There is just one person. The argument loses its logical structure, and many scholars point out that the Bible never gives Melchizedek any title associated with divine appearances. He is not called the angel of the Lord. He does not identify himself as God. Abraham does not fall on his face in worship the way people typically do when they encounter God in Scripture. The encounter is respectful, significant, and clearly supernatural in its implications, but it does not follow the pattern of other Christophanies in the Old Testament. So the question remains open: was Melchizedek a pre-incarnate Christ, a specially created being, an angel, or simply a human man whose story was deliberately written in a way that left him shrouded in mystery? There is a fourth possibility, and it might be the most brilliant one of all, because it suggests that we have been asking the wrong question this entire time. Melchizedek was a real historical human being, a Canaanite king who genuinely worshipped the true God in an age of widespread idolatry. But the way his story is told in Genesis was shaped by divine intent. Think about what is missing from Melchizedek's entry in Genesis 14. Every other major figure in Genesis gets an introduction: where they were born, who their parents were, how many years they lived. The text is meticulous about these details, but Melchizedek gets none of this. He just appears. He blesses Abraham, he receives a tithe, and he is gone. Some scholars believe this silence was intentional on God's part. By stripping away all the biographical details that would have made Melchizedek an ordinary historical figure, the text transforms him into something more. He becomes a living illustration of a priesthood that does not depend on heredity or bloodline, a priesthood that stands on its own, a priesthood that foreshadows the Messiah. In Jewish interpretive tradition, this technique is sometimes called midrash. It is the practice of drawing meaning not just from what the text says, but from what the text deliberately does not say. The loud silence around Melchizedek's origins is itself the message. This interpretation has the advantage of taking both the Genesis passage and the Hebrews passage seriously, without requiring Melchizedek to be a supernatural being. He can be a real man, a real king, a real priest, and still function as a type of Christ, specifically because the Bible chose to present him in such a mysterious way. The silence is not a gap in the record, it is the point of the record. Now, with all of that in mind, go back to Genesis 14 and look at the scene again, because there is something hiding in plain sight that changes how you read the entire encounter. Remember, two men come out to meet Abraham, Melchizedek and the king of Sodom, and the text puts them side by side for a reason. Melchizedek brings bread and wine. The king of Sodom brings a business proposition. Melchizedek blesses Abraham and gives glory to God. The king of Sodom says, "Give me the people and keep the goods for yourself." Melchizedek represents the sacred. The king of Sodom represents the worldly, and Abraham has to choose between them. He chooses well. He accepts Melchizedek's blessing and gives him a tithe. But to the king of Sodom, he says something remarkable. "I raise my hand to the Lord, God Most High, maker of heaven and earth, and swear that I will not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, so that you may never say, 'I made Abraham rich.'" Abraham refuses to be in debt to Sodom. He refuses to let the wicked king take credit for his wealth. He attributes everything to God and walks away from the deal. This moment is more than just a scene in a story. It is a test. And the test reveals Abraham's character. He can distinguish between what is holy and what is corrupt, between the blessing of God's priest and the bargaining of Sodom's king. He knows which king to honor and which king to refuse. And the irony is thick. Sodom, the city whose king tries to form a business alliance with Abraham, will be completely destroyed by God just a few chapters later. The city's wealth, the very goods the king was offering, will be ashes and sulfur. Everything Sodom had to offer was temporary and doomed, but the blessing of Melchizedek, that endures. That priesthood is eternal. That order survives the rise and fall of empires, the destruction of temples, the scattering of nations. It points forward across millennia to something permanent and unshakable. Let us return to the Dead Sea Scrolls for a moment, because there is a detail that connects Melchizedek to something much larger than just the priesthood. The Melchizedek Scroll, 11Q13, links Melchizedek to the concept of jubilee. In the book of Leviticus, God commands Israel to observe a jubilee year every 50 years. During the jubilee, all debts are forgiven, all slaves are freed, and all land returns to its original owners. It is a year of total liberation, a reset for the entire society. The Qumran scroll takes this concept and elevates it to a cosmic scale. It says that at the end of days, Melchizedek will proclaim a divine jubilee. He will free the captives, not from earthly bondage, but from the power of Belial, the prince of darkness. He will atone for the sins of the righteous. He will execute judgment on the wicked, and he will establish a kingdom of peace. And here is where this gets personal, because the scroll quotes a passage that Jesus himself would later read aloud in a synagogue in one of the most dramatic moments of his entire ministry. The scroll quotes Isaiah 61, the same passage that Jesus read in the synagogue at Nazareth when he announced his public ministry. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives." When Jesus read those words in the synagogue and then told the stunned congregation, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing," he was making a claim that would have resonated with anyone familiar with the Melchizedek tradition. He was saying, in effect, "I am the one who brings the ultimate jubilee. I am the one who sets the captives free. I am the priest-king that Melchizedek foreshadowed." Whether the people in that synagogue made the Melchizedek connection is debatable, but the theological link is there, buried in the layers of Jewish tradition, waiting to be uncovered. And if you think the mystery stops with Christianity and Judaism, it does not. Melchizedek's shadow stretches even further than that. In Islamic tradition, there is a mysterious figure known as Al-Khidr, mentioned in the Quran in Surah 18. Al-Khidr is described as a servant of God who possesses divine knowledge. He appears to Moses and demonstrates a wisdom that Moses cannot understand. In some Islamic interpretations, Al-Khidr is immortal, still wandering the earth, still serving God in ways that human beings cannot comprehend. Some scholars have noted the parallels between Al-Khidr and Melchizedek. Both appear without explanation. Both possess divine authority. Both are connected to Jerusalem. Both exist outside normal human categories. Some Islamic commentators have even suggested that they might be the same figure. This is speculative, and there is no scholarly consensus on the connection, but it illustrates something important. Melchizedek is not just a mystery within Christianity or Judaism. He is a mystery that echoes across religious traditions, the archetype of a righteous priest-king who exists outside the normal boundaries of history, who serves God in a way that transcends any single tradition or system of worship. And maybe that is the point. Maybe Melchizedek's mystery is not a problem to be solved, but a truth to be recognized, that God's work is not confined to any single institution or lineage, that before there were Levites or Aaronites, before there was a temple or a tabernacle, before there were any of the structures that human beings build to organize their relationship with God, there was already a priest who served the Most High. So who was Melchizedek? After everything we have explored, there is really only one answer that accounts for all the evidence, and the Bible itself gives it to us. We just have to be willing to see it. Melchizedek's identity is Jesus, not literally, not in the sense that the pre-incarnate Christ walked into the king's valley and handed Abraham a loaf of bread. The writer of Hebrews is clear on that. Melchizedek was made like the Son of God. Like. He was not the Son of God. He was the portrait of the Son of God, painted 2,000 years before the Son of God was born. And that is what makes this so shocking. God planted a 3-verse cameo in the book of Genesis, stripped away every identifying detail, gave him titles that no human should carry, and left him sitting in the text like a time capsule. No father, no mother, no genealogy, no beginning, no end. A priest forever. For 1,000 years, nobody knew what to do with him. Then David caught a glimpse and wrote Psalm 110. For another 1,000 years, rabbis argued about it. Then the writer of Hebrews opened the capsule and showed the world what was inside. Melchizedek was never meant to be understood on his own. He was meant to be understood through Christ. Every detail about him, his name, his city, his dual office, his bread and wine, his eternal priesthood, was a preview of someone who had not arrived yet. God wrote the answer into Genesis and waited 3,000 years for someone to read the question. That is the shocking identity of Melchizedek. Not that he was a mysterious man, but that he was a deliberate act of God, a living prophecy embedded in history, a portrait of Jesus hidden in plain sight in the oldest book of the Bible, so precise in its details that when you finally see it, you cannot unsee it. King of righteousness, King of peace, priest forever, no beginning, no end, bread and wine in his hands. That is not a coincidence. That is a signature. Melchizedek appears for 3 verses. 3 verses out of 31,102 in the entire Bible, and those 3 verses contain the clearest preview of Christ in the entire Old Testament. Clearer than Isaiah 53, clearer than Psalm 22. Because those passages describe what the Messiah would suffer, Melchizedek describes who the Messiah would be: a priest without a father, a king without a genealogy, a servant of God who arrived before the law, before the temple, before the priesthood that God himself would later establish. He blessed Abraham, the father of faith. He foreshadowed Christ, the author of salvation. And he vanished into the pages of Scripture, leaving behind nothing but 3 verses and the unmistakable outline of someone who would not arrive for another 2,000 years. Roughly 2,000 years after Christ, scholars are still writing about him, theologians are still arguing about him, and you are still here, listening. Melchizedek would probably appreciate that, but we are not finished. Because there is a part of this story that most videos, most sermons, and most books on Melchizedek never cover. And it involves something being dug up right now beneath the streets of modern Jerusalem. There is a reason this story has never lost its power. There is a reason people across 3,000 years of history have been unable to set it aside. It is because Melchizedek touches something deeper than theology. He touches the human longing for a priest who truly represents God, not a priest who inherited the job because his father had it, not a priest who serves until he dies and gets replaced by the next one in line, but a priest who stands outside the system entirely, a priest whose authority does not come from any human institution, a priest who simply is. The writer of Hebrews understood this. That is why he devoted so much space to Melchizedek. He was not just making an academic argument about priesthoods and genealogies. He was saying something about the nature of Christ's relationship with humanity. Under the old system, the priest stood between the people and God, offering sacrifices that covered sin temporarily. The priest was a middleman, and like all middlemen, he was limited. He was mortal. He was flawed. He needed to offer sacrifices for his own sins before he could offer them for the people's sins. But a priest in the order of Melchizedek is different. He does not inherit the role. He is the role. His priesthood is not a job description. It is his identity. And because it is permanent, because he does not die and get replaced, his intercession for the people never stops. He does not take days off. He does not retire. He does not hand the responsibility to someone less qualified. Hebrews 7:25 puts it in language that still gives people chills to this day. He is able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. Always lives, always intercedes. A priest forever. That is the legacy of Melchizedek. Not that we know who he was, but that his existence pointed to something the world desperately needed. A mediator who would never stop. A priest who would never fail. A king whose righteousness was not a title on a scroll, but the very nature of his being. And if that were the end of the story, it would already be extraordinary. But there is physical evidence. Stones, walls, an altar, and they are sitting right where you would expect them to be. In the entire Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, there is a golden thread. It runs through every book, every story, every prophecy. It is the thread of redemption, the idea that God is always working, always preparing, always laying the groundwork for something greater than what we can see in the moment. Abraham did not understand who Melchizedek really was. He just knew this was a priest of the Most High God, and he responded with reverence. David, writing Psalm 110 1,000 years later, caught a glimpse of something eternal, a priesthood that would outlast every human institution. The community at Qumran, studying their scrolls by lamplight in the desert, sensed that Melchizedek was connected to the final liberation of humanity. And the writer of Hebrews, looking back on all of it through the lens of the cross, saw the full picture. Each generation saw a little more. Each generation understood a little deeper. But none of them saw the complete picture, because the complete picture was still unfolding. But there is still more to this story, because the city where Melchizedek ruled, the city called Salem, has a history of its own. And archaeology is starting to reveal just how ancient and significant that city was. Salem, Shalem, Jerusalem. The city has had many names across the millennia, but its roots reach back further than most people realize. When Genesis calls Melchizedek the king of Salem, it is identifying him as the ruler of what would become the most contested and sacred city on the face of the earth. Psalm 76 confirms the connection directly, stating that God's tabernacle is in Salem and his dwelling place in Zion. The original city of Salem was tiny by modern standards. It occupied roughly 12 acres on a narrow ridge known as Mount Zion, and its population was probably no more than 500 people. But its location was strategic. Steep valleys protected it on three sides, and the Gihon Spring, one of the most reliable water sources in the region, gushed from the rock at the base of the ridge. In 1997, something remarkable happened during the construction of a visitor center near the Gihon Spring. Archaeologists Ronnie Reich and Eli Shukron unexpectedly uncovered the remains of two massive towers. These were not small defensive structures. They were monumental fortifications built from enormous unworked stones, designed to protect the spring from enemy attack. The initial dating placed them in the Middle Bronze Age, roughly 2000 to 1700 BC, the time of Abraham and Melchizedek. Rabbi Jehiel Heilprin, writing in his work Seder Hadoroth in 1769, stated that Melchizedek was the first person to build a wall around Jerusalem. He wrote this 2 centuries before any archaeological evidence was found to support the claim. And yet the massive Bronze Age fortifications discovered at the Gihon Spring fit his description almost perfectly. But that is not the discovery that has archaeologists talking. What came next is far more significant. In 2010, Eli Shukron unearthed an unusual ancient structure in the city of David, above the Gihon Spring. It consisted of 4 parallel rooms carved into the bedrock. One room contained features typical of an ancient olive press. Another had a raised rectangular platform with a drainage channel carved into the floor. Shukron suggested this was the site of an altar, and the channel was designed to drain the blood of sacrifices. He called it Temple Zero, the place where Melchizedek may have served as priest, the place where Abraham may have presented his tithe. No inscriptions were found. There is no definitive proof linking the structure to Melchizedek, but the dating matches, the location matches, and the ritual features match what you would expect from a sacred site associated with a priest of God Most High. If Shukron is right, this would be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in the history of biblical scholarship. A physical remnant of Melchizedek's ministry, buried beneath thousands of years of rubble and debris, just a few steps from the spring that gave life to the city he ruled. And the geography of this story is about to get even more disturbing, because the ground Melchizedek walked on is the same ground where the most important events in biblical history would later take place. And here is a detail that most people miss entirely. After the events of Genesis 14, where Melchizedek blesses Abraham, the very next significant event involving Jerusalem is in Genesis 22, when God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac on a mountain in the land of Moriah. 2 Chronicles tells us that Solomon built his temple on Mount Moriah, the same mountain, the same location. The place where Abraham nearly sacrificed his son is the same place where, centuries later, the temple of God would stand. So think about this. Abraham meets Melchizedek, the priest of God Most High, in Salem. A short time later, God sends Abraham back to that same region, to one of the mountains in Moriah, to offer his son as a sacrifice. Abraham is being drawn back to the place where he encountered the priest, back to the city that would become Jerusalem, back to the mountain that would become the site of God's temple. The entire story is circling the same piece of ground, and that piece of ground, the ground where Melchizedek served and where Abraham worshipped, is the same ground where Jesus would be crucified roughly 2,000 years later. Salem, Jerusalem, Moriah, Golgotha, the same city, the same hills, and the same thread of priesthood, sacrifice, and redemption running through all of it like a river beneath the surface. But wait, there is one more discovery, and this one was not found in Israel. It was found buried in the Egyptian desert, and what it says about Melchizedek might be the most controversial claim of all. In 1945, the same decade that the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, an Egyptian farmer named Muhammad al-Saman was digging near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt when he unearthed a large sealed jar. Inside were 13 leather-bound codices, ancient books written in Coptic, the language of Egyptian Christians. These texts, which dated to roughly the 3rd and 4th centuries, became known as the Nag Hammadi Library, and among them was a text simply titled Melchizedek. The Nag Hammadi. Melchizedek text is very different from anything we find in the Bible or the Dead Sea Scrolls. It is a Gnostic work, meaning it comes from a branch of early Christianity that most of the church eventually condemned as heretical. The text is fragmentary, with many passages too damaged to read, but what survives is extraordinary. In this text, Melchizedek receives visions from heavenly messengers. They reveal to him the story of a Savior who will suffer, die, and rise from the dead. Melchizedek is depicted as an eschatological high priest, a cosmic warrior who fights against the forces of evil. And in one stunning passage, the text appears to identify Melchizedek directly with Jesus Christ. The Nag Hammadi Melchizedek text suggests that some early Christians did not see Melchizedek as merely a type or shadow of Christ. They saw him as Christ, the pre-incarnate Son of God, appearing under a different name in a different age, carrying out his priestly ministry long before he was born in Bethlehem. Now, the Gnostic texts are not considered reliable historical sources by mainstream Christianity. They were written centuries after the events they describe, and they often contain teachings that contradict the canonical scriptures. But they tell us something important about how the early Christian world understood Melchizedek. The fascination was not limited to a few scholars or one community. It was widespread. Christians, Jews, and Gnostics all recognized that this figure was pointing to something vast and significant, and the debate was fierce. Some Christians believed Melchizedek was Christ himself. Others insisted he was just a man. Some Jewish teachers identified him with Shem. Others, possibly in reaction to Christian claims, downplayed his importance entirely. Melchizedek became a battleground, not a physical one, but a theological one. Different communities fought over his identity because they understood something crucial. Whoever controls the meaning of Melchizedek controls the meaning of the priesthood itself, and whoever controls the priesthood has the authority to define humanity's relationship with God. And then there is the darkest part of the Melchizedek story, the part that involves his evil counterpart. The Qumran community did not just elevate Melchizedek, they also created a dark mirror of him. In their writings, there is a figure called Melchizedek. His name means king of wickedness. He is the exact opposite of Melchizedek, the king of righteousness. Where Melchizedek leads the sons of light, Melchizedek leads the sons of darkness. Where Melchizedek brings liberation and atonement, Melchizedek brings corruption and destruction. This cosmic duality, light against darkness, righteousness against wickedness, shows up throughout the Dead Sea Scrolls. The War Scroll describes a final battle between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. And Melchizedek stands at the center of it all, not just as a historical figure from Genesis, but as a cosmic champion fighting for the soul of creation. The leader of the dark side is sometimes called Belial, sometimes Melchizedek, sometimes the Prince of Darkness. But the symmetry is always there. Two kings, two opposing forces, one fight that will determine the fate of everything. And here is what makes this relevant. The New Testament describes the same conflict. Paul writes about putting on the armor of God to stand against the spiritual forces of evil. The book of Revelation describes a final battle between the forces of heaven and the forces of darkness. And Jesus, the priest in the order of Melchizedek, stands at the center of it all, doing exactly what the Qumran texts said Melchizedek would do, liberating the captives, atoning for sins, judging the wicked, establishing a kingdom of peace. The story that began in a desert cave with a handful of scroll fragments connects seamlessly to the largest narrative in the Bible: creation, fall, redemption, judgment, restoration. Melchizedek is woven into every stage, so let us bring this all together. Because what started as a 3-verse cameo in Genesis has turned into the most elaborate preview of Christ in the entire Old Testament. We have a man with no name before he appears and no trace after he vanishes. A king of a city that would become the holiest place on earth. A priest who served the true God in an age of universal idolatry. A figure who received honor from the father of the Jewish faith. A mystery that haunted Jewish scholars for centuries and inspired an entire chapter of the New Testament. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls calling him a divine warrior who would bring the final jubilee. We have the Nag Hammadi texts identifying him with Christ. We have Philo calling him the embodied Word of God. We have the rabbis fighting over whether he was Shem or someone else entirely. We have archaeologists digging up what might be his temple beneath the streets of modern Jerusalem. And we have the writer of Hebrews telling us, in the clearest language the New Testament has to offer, that every single one of those details was pointing to Jesus. That is the shocking identity of the priest without a father. He was never meant to be a standalone character. He was meant to be a mirror, and when you hold that mirror up to the life of Christ, every detail aligns. The name, the city, the priesthood, the bread and the wine, the blessing, the eternity. God hid that mirror in 3 verses of Genesis, and for 2,000 years before Christ, nobody fully understood what they were looking at. That moment in the King's Valley, that simple act of blessing and nourishment, set something in motion that is still reverberating today. Every time a communion table is set, every time a priest or pastor stands between a congregation and God, every time someone reads the letter to the Hebrews and wonders about the meaning of an eternal priesthood. Melchizedek is there, quietly, persistently, pointing beyond himself to the one he was always meant to reveal. 3 verses, 3,000 years of questions, one answer hidden in plain sight, and a priest who remains even now, forever. If this video changed how you see the Old Testament, you are not alone. The Bible is full of hidden portraits like this, figures and moments that only make sense when you see who they were pointing to. If you want to discover the next one, the video on your screen right now will take you there. Click it, and I will see you there.